Shading. That's the focus of this video. And so what is shading? Shading is basically like coloring, except there isn't any colors. Instead, you are coloring with different values. Darks, lights, white, and all the grays that you can think of in between. Let's look at this photo really quick. Where are the darkest values that you can find in this photograph? Well, we've got this line right here is pretty darn dark. Got Superman's hair right there, I think is pretty dark. These deep dark shadows down in the crevices between objects. Deep dark shadows right here, pretty dark. You got the string that I have for my mask, really dark. The lettering on this keychain, the lettering on the pencil, all very dark. Those are the darkest values that I can see in the photograph. What are the lightest values that you can see in the photograph? Well, okay. Looking at the background's pretty darn light. The white of the paper in my sketchbook is pretty light. The tip of the pencil is pretty light. The highlights over on this metal band around this brush, paintbrush, that's pretty light. Same thing right here. A little bit of highlights on Superman. The white details in the mask, those seem to be the lightest. And then there's lots of values in between, right? So you have the purple, which is not black, and it's not white, it's somewhere in between. You got the red, it's somewhere in between yellows and browns and grays and blues and reds. Those are all somewhere in between. And so when we look at those, we can compare them too. We can be like, okay, so is the red or the purple darker? I'm not sure. I think generally I'm kind of like thinking that the purple feels darker than the red. I'm looking at, the blue and the red over here. I'm feeling in general, this is me, that the blue feels darker than the red. We got these drawn lines and shading in this sketchbook page. You can see the differences in value there. So like, is this darker or is this darker? Comparing, are they the same? How does it compare with this? Like, I'm looking at this blue compared to the purple. Which one's lighter, which one's darker? I'm going to go with the purple. So your job is to take all of those things into consideration when you're shading your artwork. Pretty much, there's almost no place, there's very few places on this image that are 100% white. So technically, almost everything should be shaded. Even the whites, if you want to be really technical about it, even the whites are different. Which one of these is darker? These are both supposed to be white, apparently. This one looks more yellow. This one looks more gray. Especially when I compare it to bright highlights on metal. This looks gray. So even the white of the background is really not even white. So technically there's so much to shade here. And I want you to think about all of those things. So I'm going to go ahead and get started shading my artwork right here. And I'm going to be paying attention to those same things. And throughout, I'm going to be narrating to give you tips and tricks about how to tackle your drawing well. And hopefully you will feel successful with how it goes. So the first places that I'm going to tackle is I'm going to generally kind of just start shading some darker areas. And for the purposes of this video, I'm probably not going to shade my entire artwork. It would take too long and make too long of a video. I can demonstrate all of the skills that I need to demonstrate for you by just shading one or two of these objects. But just because I'm shading one or two of these objects, you should still shade all of them. That's your assignment, okay? I'm going to start with this mask over here, and I'm going to start blocking in some of these really dark values.
As I begin shading, I want to be conscious of how I'm creating lines with my shading, or how I'm not creating lines with my shading. I can do both, depending on if I want to create texture or if I want it to look really smooth. I want to compare and look at the texture of the actual object that I'm trying to shade. And the mask is fairly smooth and soft looking. It doesn't look like it has a lot of texture. So in this particular case, I'm going to go with trying to not have the appearance of lines very much. And so in order to do that, I'm going to have to be very gentle with my shading, especially at first, by controlling my pressure. I'm just going to try not to press too hard. Another thing I'll try to do is shade in multiple directions. I'm less likely to see lines or streaks in my shading if I consistently shade in multiple directions. So right now in the drawing, I've kind of moved away from shading only the darkest spots of the mask. I'll be getting back to that for sure, but I've moved into shading some of the medium values as well. And the way I transition from shading darker values to less dark values is by altering the amount of pressure I apply and the number of layers that I shade. I'm sure it's very obvious to you all that if I shade more layers, just kind of keep shading in the same area, that area is going to get darker and darker. And if I shade less layers in an area, that area will not get as dark. One simple trick for shading and trying not to have as many lines be visible is to work your pencil down to a flat spot. That's also why, if you're learning to shade, using a mechanical pencil is probably not the best way to go. Using a mechanical pencil for the line drawing is really useful, but then when you want to go to shade, it's kind of better to use a traditional pencil because you can change the shape of the lead to suit the type of texture and shading that you're trying to achieve. When I'm shading this mask, I'm trying to shade the whole thing, obviously, and I will shade one area, but then you'll find that I go back to areas. And the reason is because I'm continuously comparing the values. And as I shade new areas, I'm comparing them with the areas that I've already shaded and trying to make adjustments for how dark or light I think things should be. This whole time I've pretty much been talking about how smooth the shading should be. But now as I work on shading the string for my mask, that changes a little bit because now I actually want to create a little bit of a different texture to it. So you can see that I first shaded these dark lines in it and then went over the top with a little bit more soft shading. The point being that lines are not bad to have in your shading. It all depends on what kind of look you're going for, what kind of texture you want to achieve, or just what overall style you want your drawing to have.
There's of course so much left to do on this drawing. I've pretty much only tackled part of this pencil and the mask right here. I've left everything else undone. It takes a long time and a lot of patience. I'm going to end up stopping the video right here, but before I do, I just want to mention, when you do these objects that are next to other objects, your job is to compare the values and the details. So like if I were to shade this cup, I want to compare it to how I've shaded the mask. So if I think certain areas of the cup are darker than the mask, then I want to try to show that here. If I think that they're lighter than the mask, I want to try to show that here. So now go down here to this brush right here. It's another example. I want to look at the blue versus the purple, Try to notice areas that are darker or lighter in comparison to other areas and shade it accordingly. Okay? Other things that I kind of want to pay attention to are cast shadows. So, little shadows that show that light isn't getting underneath of other objects. Here's a cast shadow here. There's cast shadows right here and here underneath. I've sort of shaded that a little bit on one of my objects so far. So a little bit of cast shadow shading. It's shown right here, right? So we want to pay attention to all of those things. Notice also that as I shade, I'm trying to build detail. So for instance, in this section right here, it's shown right here, there's details in there that weren't there before, and as I shaded it, I drew and shaded in those details. Same thing with these little details too. I left some stuff out of my mask. There's these dashed lines that trail around, and I intended to do those, but I kind of just ran out of time. What I would do is I would shade it like this, and then I would probably go back in and very carefully erase out those little segments of that dashed line. I'd do that with my eraser, and then that would require me that I go back in with my pencil and kind of shade around them to clean them up. So I would do that. It's just I opted to shade it all first, and then I was going to go back in and carve those lines back out with my eraser. Okay, so I'm going to leave it right there for you to get started, and I wish you good luck and have fun with it.